There we go. Okay, good morning, good afternoon. Okay, so we're on lesson 3, and our key verse for this whole series of lessons, of course, is Esther 4:13, the B part. And it goes, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this.
I found mine.
Okay, our key verse for this particular lesson is John 17:15. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. These are Jesus's words. And it's very applicable to this particular story because in chapter 2 of Esther, Esther now enters the story. She's living in a pagan culture. God didn't pull her out of that culture. He used her within that culture. And he protected her from evil. And we'll find out that he protected her in many, many, many ways. Remember, she lived in a very worldly culture. We now live in a very worldly culture. Okay, we're specifically looking at Esther 2, 1 through 18 in this lesson. And I hope you all have your Bibles open to that. We don't have too many extra verses that we will be looking at today. Not as many as we usually do, but we will be reading right through Esther pretty much just in 2 or 3 verses at a time and looking to see what it says in 2 through 18. Now, on your outline, it says setting the stage. I'm going to do a little bit of review. Remember that we had the Assyrians came in and they defeated Israel and took off the Jewish people into exile, and they've been living in exile. Then a little bit later comes along the Babylonians, and they beat the Assyrians and they defeat Judah. And so now all of the Jewish people, well, there she is, hello. All of the Jewish people are now exiled. The whole country is exiled, all 12 tribes. And so that happens with Babylon when Cyrus, the Persian king, takes over and defeats Babylon. Now, Cyrus has a different philosophy. The Persians had a different philosophy. They thought it was best if they repatriate the Jews into their homeland. They did this for all of their captured peoples because they believed that that would make the gods of the areas in those lands happy and that would make people prosperous. They felt like it would be a more peaceable, prosperous way to handle things. Now, many of the Jews actually did not go back to Jerusalem or Israel. It was at that time called the land beyond the river. They had to decide, they were brought, when Cyrus came in, they were brought to a point in their lives where they had to decide what to do with their religion and their culture. Many of them didn't decide to go back. We talked about that. Some of them decided not to go back because they thought it was too dangerous, or, they had businesses that they were happy with where they are. Maybe they had lost a lot of their religion. They hadn't been worshiping in the temple for a long time. All kinds of reasons, but very, very few of the Jews actually went back. Mordecai and Esther were among those Jews that even though they kept part of their Jewish religion and Jewish customs, they fit into the culture. They learned to fit into the culture. And as we go on and look at this, Mordecai will tell Esther not to tell him she's Jewish. I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to think about it before we get into it. People in our area, do they know you're Christian? Does the person that works on your car know you're a Christian? Does the store clerk know that you're a Christian? Do your neighbors know that you're a Christian and that your faith is important to you? Or are you blending into the culture? Now, I'm not talking just to you. When I point the finger that way, I'm also pointing a lot back towards me. So I think one of the things we need to be careful about is making sure that we are not invisible Christians, that we are visible Christians. Okay, we are in chapter 2. This is about 55 years after they could have returned to Jerusalem. So Mordecai, does she have chapter 3? No. Okay, honey, we should get that to her. Mordecai maybe might have been as old as 55, but I doubt it. I bet they had lived their whole life. You know, I know they had lived their whole life in Susa. Mordecai and Esther were deeply ensconced into the religion, the culture in Persia. So it had been about 55 years since they could still first return back to Jerusalem. We are in 483 BC. This is the year that Esther comes into the scene. King Xerxes at this time had reigned in the Persian government for actually 7 years. It will tell us that later on. He had reigned for 3 years before we hit chapter 1. What happens in chapter 1? Well, he did what? Do you remember what happens in chapter 1? He partied. There were 2 banquets and they partied big time. I mean, it wasn't just a one-day party, it was a big time party. Now, what he was doing, remember, his father had been defeated by the Greeks. And that was the one defeat that his father had. And he wanted to avenge that, and he wanted to defeat the Greeks. So the reason why he actually threw all those parties and everything is so they could get all of his rulers together, his military people together, and they could plan a campaign. And remember also, they thought that if you were drunk, that you were closer in contact with the gods, and they would tell you their real will. Now that sounds a little strange. You and I know that doesn't happen with being drunk. But, you know, that creative thing, what in our culture do we have that's kind of a parallel to that? Do we have musicians, artists, actors, and other such creatives that are creating things, planning things, or whatever else that get high on alcohol or drugs or other things? So it's not such a foreign concept or a foreign idea when you stop and think about it. We do it in our culture too. I hope you don't, but it happens in our culture too. Anyway, so when we have chapter 1, Xerxes or Ahasuerus, I have to always stop and think how to pronounce that, had been reigning for 3 years. They were deciding to whether they could how they could beat the Greeks. Now, I'm going to refer you to your maps, and I'm going to try and kind of show this on here too. It's kind of backwards. But remember, the Persians had all of this land, except for over here is Greece, way over here. You know, we had beyond the river, that's where Jerusalem was. We have Susa, that's over here. We have India, clear over here. The Persians controlled all of that land, but he wasn't satisfied with controlling all of that land. He wanted to also come over here to Greece and to honor his father's name, to defeat Greece too. He wanted to be the big name guy too. So, you know, he has this huge army. He gets it all together. He goes over and they fight Greece, and guess what? Greece defeats them. You know, he was arrogant. He had an army that moved too slow, all of that. So he comes back to Susa with his tail between his legs, and he sits down, and we have chapter 1 happening. Now, we have to go back, chapter 2 happening. We need to look at Queen Vashti. You know, I kind of like this little gal. You know, I mean, she really was treated wrongly. She was the queen. She was probably a princess. I mean, she wouldn't have been the queen if she hadn't have been a princess. She had been raised in the court. She knew all the right things to do. She was a very powerful lady. She controlled lands. She governed. She made sure the palace ran smoothly, and all of that. And then she gets asked to go in and do this humiliating appearance in front of all of these drunken men. And it would have been humiliating even if they hadn't have been drunken, because princesses and queens did not go around displaying themselves. That wasn't proper. So, she was badly treated. Xerxes didn't like the idea that she disobeyed him. He didn't take credit for doing anything wrong, which he did. And so his advisors, and we met that guy called Memucan, his 7 advisors, and Memucan was the big guy in the group. And he said, hey, we can't have all of our wives, disobeying us. And they'll think they can do that if you let Vashti get by with this. So you demote her. And that's exactly what he did. Now, he comes back. He is been defeated by the Greeks. He has to get rid of his queen. And by all historical records, they probably had a fairly good relationship going on. And then he has to get rid of his queen. He gets defeated. He comes back. And we start off in chapter 2. Okay. Esther. Okay, Esther chapter 2, verse 1. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 4. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, and we don't know whether it was because of Vashti or the defeat by the Greeks, but probably the defeat by the Greeks as much as anything, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed upon her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all of these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Well, we have a royal beauty contest coming on, and apparently his attendants think that beautiful virgins will just solve all of their king's problems. I find that interesting. He had a harem anyway. Why would he need more beautiful virgins? But apparently that was what they thought they needed. So they were going to have this virgin beauty contest. And Hegai was the king's eunuch in charge of the harem. Now remember, males could not go into the harem unless they were eunuchs. And probably they were slaves. Even if they were not slaves, they would have been outcasts in the normal culture if they had been put out. They wouldn't have had any way to make a living. And, they had a pretty cushy job as far as, they had plenty of food, a warm place to stay, and actually prestige, because if he was in charge of the whole harem, he had quite a little bit of influence there. Remember, we had a palace for the women and we had a palace for the king. Hegai is mentioned by name, so he would have been fairly powerful. Okay, any thoughts or comments about verses 1 through 4? Okay, let's look at verses 5, 6, and 7. Now, there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, who he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother had died. Okay, verse 5 tells us about the lineage of Mordecai. He was a member of the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin was the smallest tribe. Actually, Benjamin was located, the land for the tribe of Benjamin was located in a small area south of Jerusalem, maybe southwest of Jerusalem, and it was kind of in the middle of the tribe of Judah. It was not totally separated out. Mordecai and Esther's family had probably been in exile for over 100 years, so they had no real tie back to the homeland, although they kept track of what tribe they belonged to. And Mordecai was kind of a nice guy because he cared for his young cousin. We don't know how old Mordecai was. I'm thinking he's probably middle-aged, okay? One of the things that struck me is that Esther had a Jewish name and a Persian name. Why do you think that was? Maybe because they wanted to keep it secret that she was a Jewish woman, kind of hide it from the culture, kind of help her fit in. It's a small thing, you know, kind of having a second name, kind of like a nickname. That's no big deal.
Was Hadassah the Jewish name?
Hadassah was the Jewish name, yes. Now, I'm going to ask you, what small things in your life do you do to help make you fit in? Probably not having a pet name, but what other small things do you do in your life? Or let's make it less personal. You see other people doing that help them fit in with our culture to keep their Christianity from becoming controversial.
Well, not necessarily at my house, but I do know families who have the rule when they have big family gatherings or big gatherings. They have rules. You don't talk about politics. You don't talk about the religion. Is that what you're?
Yeah, when family gatherings or other types of gatherings, there's the rule you don't talk about religion. You don't mention religion.
It seems to be controversial sometimes in some families or settings.
Seems to be controversial in some families or settings, yes. Debbie, you can contribute.
I know. I know I can.
Okay. That might be one way. One way might be not wearing your crosses or religious jewelry, not saying a prayer in a restaurant before a meal, that type of thing.
Yep.
Can you think of anything else? If you think of something, bring it up later, okay? Because I think we get so used to our culture and the accommodations we make that we aren't even aware of the fact that we're making an accommodation that we should make. You know, if we learn how to do what Jesus did, he asked questions rather than you shall not in our religious things, or you have to do this if you are going to be a Christian, you know, or Christians don't believe that. I mean, if we learn how to communicate in a winsome manner, in a manner that's not abrasive, in a manner that's helping people question their positions instead of dictating our position to them. You know, isn't it much more convicting when somebody gets you to thinking, you go, you know, I hadn't thought about that before. Maybe I need to think about that. Much more effective than saying, you shall not, kind of thing. And I think we get too much into that. And I think that's part of the reason why religion is not brought up. And we get hung up on little things. Maybe it isn't such a little thing, but you know, we get hung up on whether when we have the sacraments, should you have intinction or should you have the little cup? we could get to fighting about that, which is the most religious way to do it or the most pleasing to God. Who cares? That's not we are to worship God, and how we worship God, that little, which way it is, I don't know as it makes that much difference. We're both talking about the blood and the bread. So anyway, I think it's attitude and the way we go about it. Okay, let's look at Esther 8 through 11. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Okay, the plot thickens. Okay, verse 8, the order is set out, we have an edict. I am guessing, because I know in my version it says in verse 8, Esther was taken. What do your versions say in verse 8? Was taken? Okay. Some versions will say the virgins. Huh?
Mine says, okay. Also was taken, yeah.
Okay. Some will say were gathered. Okay, does that sound like they had a lot of free will?
No.
No, exactly. So I am guessing that if they sent men out to go looking around, and if they saw a pretty lady, they gathered her up and brought her back. Now, I am guessing because some people would have wanted their pretty daughters in the palace and wanted them to have a chance at becoming queen, that they probably paraded their daughters in their finest out in front of them. You always have those type of parents. So anyway, that could have happened. I doubt very seriously if that's probably what Mordecai and Esther did. Because to marry a pagan was forbidden by God. So, you had to be a little bit careful about that. There is no evidence. I want to point out there is no, first of all, we didn't get anything about Esther resisting. So, I mean, she was involved enough in the culture that she didn't resist this. Mordecai didn't resist this. They probably looked on it as a chance to make their lives better and didn't think about the negative aspects of it. There is no evidence that the contestants here had to do anything immoral. They were just selected and were to compete for Xerxes' attention. And from all reports, Esther was true to Xerxes throughout her life. So she was, monogamous. All of the contestants, if you were brought in to be a contestant and brought into the palace, probably had to stay there for life. They probably became an automatic part of the harem. Okay, in verse 9, we learn that Esther is not a run-of-the-mill pretty girl. It says she pleased him and won his favor. That means she didn't resist in any way, yes. Haggai was used to being around the pretty women and knew what would please the king. And immediately when he saw Esther, I'm guessing that she had a demeanor about her as she walked about, one of confidence, one of humility. I would imagine her manner of speech was of such that It wasn't like you know, kind of thing. So I'm guessing that he goes, this gal may have something a little more than the normal beautiful woman. So he set her aside, and what did he do? He gave her, in verse 9,
Special treatment.
yeah, special treatment. She got 7 attendants. 7 attendants? What in the world would I do with? Huh?
Good food, that I'd be in there.
Yeah, good food, got nice rooms, and 7 attendants. I don't know if I would want 7 attendants around me all the time. That would drive me nuts. She didn't have to do anything other than be beautiful. Yeah, and those attendants would have done things like, you know, well, we will learn as we go on here what they did for her. Okay, in verse 10, Esther did not reveal her nationality. She knew she shouldn't. Mordecai, as a matter of fact, told her that she shouldn't reveal her nationality. She was obedient to him. She was honoring of his requests. She trusted his judgment. And as we go on through the chapter, we'll learn that Mordecai is a man of integrity. You know, at times it's a good strategy to just keep your mouth shut. And at this time, she knew it was smart to keep her mouth shut. You know, in our modern day world, I take a new job and I walk into the break room and they have a Playboy calendar up there and they're telling dirty jokes. It's not the time to go to my new boss and say, hey, boss, I don't like this. You need to do something about that. And you will figure out ways to maybe not be in there, to not participate in it. But, you know, maybe 6 months down the road, you might be able to say, that's really pretty offensive, I think. You know, but you can't do it right away. You have to gain the trust and you have to establish your integrity. I just threw that one up out in the air. Can anybody think of a better example? Okay. Anyway, so sometimes it's good to keep your mouth shut. She knew when she should keep her mouth shut. She did it. Now, we know in verse 11, Mordecai loved her and he was missing her. How do we know that? Because he walked her outside the courtyard. Now, it probably had a wall to it. I doubt very seriously if Esther could have gotten close to the wall and talked to him, but through the attendants, he could say, hey, do you know Esther? How's she doing? You know, let me know how Esther's doing, and maybe build a friendship with some of them, a couple of the servants or whatever, and keep regular contact. Hey, could you give Esther a message from me?
But they never did use the Jewish names. The Hadassah or whatever.
Yeah, Hadassah. No, he would have used Esther because that would have pegged her as Jewish.
Oh.
And he didn't want anybody knowing she was Jewish at this point. It wasn't safe. Okay, let's look at Esther 12 through 14. Before a young woman's turn came to go in to King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning, return to another part of the harem to the care of, okay, just a minute, Shaashaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. Okay, there's quite a little bit in there. We find out that there are 12 months of beauty treatments. She's already pretty, for pity's sakes. But it would have included They talk about oils. Probably olive oil would have been one of the oils they'd used. They've been using perfumes. The oils would have been, they didn't have use a lot of soap and shampoo in those days. So the oils would have helped cleanse their bodies. Oils were used for medicinal purposes and to rid their bodies of lice. And of course, perfumes would make them smell good. Now, there were other things besides just making her body beautiful and rubbing. She would have had baby smooth skin, and they would have probably painted her fingernails, and they would have learned how to put on the best makeup, and they would have tried a lot of different kinds of hairstyles and fancy hairdos and all of that. Still, 6 months for doing that seems like a long time to me. But anyway, the other parts of it, she had 7 attendants from the palace. So she was probably learning court protocol. She would have been learning how to handle her eating utensils, how to speak to the king, how to carry herself, what clothing she should wear in what situations. All of that stuff. She was receiving an education in addition to the beauty treatments. Because she would not have been around the court. She wouldn't have understood what was going on in the court if she hadn't have been taught that. Now, I thought it interesting that verse 13 says they could take anything they wanted from the harem when called to the king. And I'm wondering, what in the world would they take with them? I don't know. I'm guessing that probably what gowns they wore. Maybe they had instruments. Maybe some of them played a musical instrument or that type of thing. Maybe might have been some kind of a special gift that they might give the king, that type of thing. I don't know. That's the only ideas I could come up with. And when they returned from the king, they would go to a different part of the harem. So you had a part of the harem that had the virgins in it, and then you had a part of the harem that actually had the queen in it, and then everybody else, all the concubines, were in another area. Shaashgaz, I love that name, Shaashgaz was the eunuch in charge of all the concubines. And if you were going to go back to have any chance of becoming queen, or even to be brought back to the king for any reason, you had to be called by name. I can see these gals when they went into them. Yes, I'll use Esther just because that's the name we're talking about. Esther, would love to do this for you. Esther, would like to bring you a cup of wine, whatever. You could see that you would be throwing your name out there a lot because you don't want him to forget your name. He may have liked you, but if he forgot your name, it was still too bad. So that name recognition, I thought, was kind of an interesting thing to be thrown in there. These women that were in the harem, they knew that the price that they paid was to be ready for the king's sexual desires at any time, but they also got something back for it. And they got something very valuable back for it. They got security, they had physical comforts, and they had prestige. What do people do for prestige? Oh my goodness, in our society, what do people do to make other people think they're important or good or great or better than the average person? Nothing different then than today. What do you see people giving up for power and prestige in our society? Morals? Mm-hmm. How about, do you see them lying? Putting on false fronts? Purchasing things they can't afford to make people think they have more money than they do? Manipulating behind the scenes to gain access to a person in higher standing than them, or to gain a political office, or whatever it is, to get a better job. You look at this. This is modern day. This whole chapter is modern day. Let's look at 15 through 18. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the 10th of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. We hear the 7th year of his reign. I referred to that earlier. Now, verse 17, now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with a royal liberality. Okay, so Esther goes in there, and she goes in there humble, because she says, okay, Haggai, what should I take with me? What should I wear? How should I approach the king? I mean, she asks for his advice. That's probably one of the reasons, her attitude is probably one of the reasons he promoted her. My guess is too, Haggai was in charge of him, so he kind of probably sent in a couple of the questionable ones, and then he set it all up. So when Esther went in there, she made an impression. I'm just guessing that may be true. That's not in the Bible, but I'm thinking that may be true. So anyway, he kind of helped set her up, I'm guessing. So he won all the favor of everyone who was around her, even apparently the other people, the other ladies in the harem, because she wasn't a braggart. She was pleasant. She must have had not argumentative. She wasn't a complainer, that kind of thing is my guess. It doesn't say that, but I think you can pretty well assume that. Esther knew the risks that she was involved with. And I think it's interesting that we have the 10th month of the 7th year of his reign. I mean, it tells us very specifically when all of this took place. I can't hear you. Historically, she stayed in the palace. I mean, from what I gathered in the research I did, she lived in the palace. She had, I think, 3 sons that were actually sons of Xerxes. And I think one of them actually became king after Xerxes. So, I mean, she was around. Now, can you imagine the drama that would have been going on in that palace with the women? I'm the disposed wife. You are the current wife, kind of thing. So I think you probably can assume that this banquet wasn't a marriage banquet. It does not say that, but I'm pretty sure you could say that, you could assume that. Yeah. I do a lot of assuming in some of this stuff because they don't give you all the details. God doesn't think you have to have all the details. My imagination can run away with it, let me tell you. So anyway, should she have refused all of this to happen? Well, she really had no real option for refusal. She had few rights. She remembered what happened to Vashti. She heard about that. So she probably had few rights. Now, I want to look at how God tells us in the Bible that we should respond. And I've given you some verses on your sheet. We're going to look at Romans 13:1 first. Romans 13:1 says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Sometimes it's kind of hard to take that some of these wicked authorities are there, but God has allowed them to be there, and he is going to work his work around those evil people. So we are to respect our government authorities. whether we like them or not, we are to show them the appropriate, we aren't to be, we're to show them the appropriate respect. I'll just leave it at that. Now, let's look at Exodus 1:15. This points out a different thing. Exodus 1:15. Now, we're in Egypt, and we have the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has made these edicts that he's getting a little worried because Joseph is there in Egypt, and the Jewish people are very, they reproduce abundantly. And there's a lot of the Jewish people in Egypt. He's getting a little worried about their power. So let's read 15. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women bring childbirth to the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. So in this instance, God blessed them because they disobeyed the government authorities. Now, the government authority was telling them to kill babies. That is against God's rules. You know, you are not to do what government, if the government tells you to break one of God's rules, you are to disobey that government rule. So you get both sides of that. Now, I'm not going to read anything in Daniel 3. I wrote it down. That Daniel 3 is the story of where Daniel was told, the satraps and stuff got really mad. And so they wanted to Nebuchadnezzar to tell everybody that they had to worship and bow down before Nebuchadnezzar's statue. And Daniel refused to bow down at Nebuchadnezzar's image. And because he refused to do this, that is where he was thrown into the furnace. Daniel refused to worship anybody on earth. He only worshiped God. And so he followed God's rule there, and he was thrown into the furnace, and God saved him. Daniel 6 is another very good example. And they were to pray, where they had developed a rule to pray to King Darius. And if he prayed to any other thing other than King Darius, he was supposed to be killed. Well, Daniel goes right up, opens his window and gets out on his balcony and bows down and prays to God. Okay, because he was not going to pray to Darius, the king. So he was thrown into the lion's den. And those are those two famous stories where he disobeyed the government because it would have put him at odds with what he should have been doing according to God. I'm going to just jump back just real quickly to a verse in verse 17, 18, I think it's in 18, well, maybe it's 17, where it says that the king crowned Esther. The first thought that came through my mind is, I wonder if he had a pedestal over here with a crown on top of it. And if the gal that came to him pleased him, he took that crown off and put it on her head right there. I just thought that would have been funny. I doubt seriously if that's the case. It was probably done in a more formal manner. The banquet and the declared holiday throughout the province. There were a lot of gifts. He was very happy. Everything was going well. Okay. Any comments that you have about those first 18 verses in chapter 2? Okay. What does God want us to know? Well, the story of Esther is unfolding. We know that she is an extraordinary young lady and that she has a very pleasant personality. But she's not perfect, as none of us are. She blends in with her culture, as we probably do too much, but that's okay. That's all I have to say about that. I want to look at 1 John 2, 15, 16, and 17. 1 John 2, 15, 16, and 17. It says, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. Now, I think there's several cautions we need to have on this. This is very, very powerful. These are very, very powerful verses and powerful verses to live by. It says, do not love the world or anything in the world. Now, whoa, stop. I thought God said he loved the world and he loved his creation. Yes, he does. It's not saying that we can't love the beauty of the world and we can't love God's creation. That's not what it's saying. What it's saying is to put undue importance on the world and the creation. The most important thing to us has to always be God, not things that are in or of this world. It goes on down a ways and it talks about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Human desires are okay. God created those desires within us, the desire to do right, the desire to make people happy, the desire to love, the desire to better ourselves. Those are all godly things. There's nothing wrong with those. It's how much importance you place on it. If the most important thing in my life is to become the head of the company, then that is wrong. If the most important thing in my life is to do a very good job and to advance within my company as I do a good job and earn that advancement, but I'm going to love God first and foremost, that's okay. That's a good thing. So it's that balance of how important it is it in your life? Are you keeping your priorities straight? From the lust of the eyes, we get to looking at things and I'm going, I like the looks of that car. Raymond, I think we ought to buy a new car. That car looks a lot better than our car does. Don't you think we ought to? I know, we bought a car. But there wasn't that kind of a lust about it, was there? No.
Not on my part.
Not on your part, not on mine. I know he kept his old car. He didn't want to give it up. But there was some practical aspects to it in that our cars are getting very old. We need to have another vehicle that we can learn how to drive and keep into our old age, because those cars get hard to figure out after you get so old, and they're different and they have different controls. I know. I mean, the business of not having to put the key in the ignition to turn the thing on just drives me crazy. So, there are just, some practical aspects of it. Yeah, sure. I like having nice things, don't you? And we all enjoy nice things. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the importance that we place on it.
I think that verse is basically just saying love God more than anything else.
You're right. Love God more than anything else. It's okay to want and to appreciate and to desire, but as long as God is the first thing that's in our lives. Arrogance, it says pride of life. Arrogance is never good. That's the one thing there that that's never good.
Sandy, even if you might think you're lusting over it, but after you get it, after a while, it's just sitting out there. It's not, it's not that big of a deal and everything, you know, you thought you really, really wanted, but you know, after all,
The news
just-
wears off
it's
quick.
just an article.
After, you know, it sits, we mentioned here that after it sits out there for a while, you know, you may have thought you really wanted it, you may have really coveted it, but after so long, the new wears off and we don't covet it anymore. You know, then we covet something else new. So, you know, the things of this world, the things that we have in this world, they will pass away eventually. And they will age and they will lose their shine and luster. But one thing we are for sure of, God will never lose his shine and luster. God will never go away. God will never age. God is there forever. Okay, applying God's message to my life. Distinguishing between what is acceptable to God and what displeases God presents a challenge to the Christian. Satan manipulates our perceptions in small steps until the unacceptable in God's eyes appears to be fine in our eyes. We must constantly examine our thoughts, motives, and actions to be sure we have not gradually succumbed to the ways of the sinful world. And I think that gradualness, those things that gradually come on us, that we gradually accept, are where we get tripped up most often. It's not that we go out to sin, it's just that we kind of just gradually allow that sin to come into our lives. And that's why we need to examine it all the time. And I think we need to pray, God, what sin have I allowed into my life that I've become numb to, that I didn't realize I was allowing into my life? What sin is there that I need to eradicate now that I've allowed into my life? And the last thing on your sheet, ask God to reveal areas of your life which displeases him. So, very relevant lesson to today's world. And we have a few more interesting things happening as we move on in Esther. We will be in Esther, we'll finish up Esther 2 and do all of Esther 3 next week. Are there any thoughts or questions that you want to bring out? I'm sorry? No, we'll be doing the rest of chapter 2 and all of Esther 3, which is lesson 4.